reached a point in my life where I don't understand why anyone would actually want to become president. I bring that up because we have a presidential election coming up next year, and this was election week, and it felt like it fit. But I don't understand why anybody would actually want the job, right? I mean, as a little kid, I thought it'd be cool to be a president, but that's just because I thought everybody would have to do whatever I told them to do, and that I'd finally get my dream of a chocolate milkshake fountain. It's an outdoor fountain, but instead of water, it's got chocolate milkshake in it. It should be easy to do, but the science just isn't there yet. But in any case, like beyond my dreams of being president as a kid, where it's just you have to be my friend or I'll push the button, it just doesn't seem like it's something I actually want to do. Because in any form of leadership, there's all sorts of outside things that happen. There's all sorts of criticisms that take place and people who are questioning everything that you do, whether that thing be coming out with the annual budget for the country or whether that be getting your lunch order. There are going to be a bunch of talking head pundits that we have the audacity to call the news that are going to be talking about it for hours to come and questioning everything that you do and say and think and, I don't know, everything that you do. It's a kind of a thankless job to be in that sort of position of leadership. Again, any position of leadership is difficult, but especially to that level. And all of that stress that you have to deal with as president is absolutely gigantic. If you look at pictures of guys from their inauguration and then look at them when they leave office, they age like 40 years. And that's in times of peace. I can't imagine the kind of stress that would have to be there when things are happening while the country's at war, or when hostilities begin to rise amongst us. Take, for example, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, some of you guys may actually remember that time period of your life, but if you're not familiar or if you've forgotten what it was, the Cuban Missile Crisis may have actually been two of the most stressful weeks in the entire world's existence. See, what had happened is the United States had gotten satellite imagery over the island of Cuba, an island that was communist and had aligned itself with Russia, and this is all still taking place really in the middle of the Cold War. And those satellite images revealed that the Russians were building various missile silos that had nuclear capabilities, and that those missiles would have the range to be able to hit nearly every major U.S. city before we'd ever have a chance at retaliation. As President Kennedy was given this news, he was told by his advisors and by various people on his cabinet that he needed to act, and he needed to act now, that our best course of action was to launch an immediate attack on the island of Cuba, was to invade with everything that we've got to go knock those silos out before they have a chance at being finished. That maybe we'd have a chance at getting through this entire situation. We'd be able to attack it, destroy those silos. Yeah, probably there's going to be a lot of Cuban civilian casualties, and there's a chance that the Russians would have retaliated, likely on U.S. soil, but at least the threat of the nuclear option would be wiped out. These guys kept telling him over and over again, this is what we have to do. This is the best choice, the best course of action that we have. After President Kennedy mulled everything over, he reached a decision. He sent a huge naval brigade to Cuba. And he told them, just surround the place. Surround the entire island with our full naval force available to us. But don't do anything else. He said to, and this was his word, not mine, quarantine the island of Cuba. That word takes on a different meaning for us today, doesn't it? The light agrees. Can anybody else see it blinking, or is it just me? Okay, cool. Anyway, now I've pointed out, that's all you're looking at. But just to go and put the naval force there. Just don't do anything, but just show them that we're there. That's all we're going to do. And so the Navy sat around the entire island of Cuba for 13 days. For 13 days, everyone was watching what was going to happen on this tiny little island of Cuba. Understand that this tension could not have been any higher, because if anybody accidentally pushes the wrong button, full-scale war breaks out. Likely, nuclear war breaks out, involving the destruction of everything. The world itself was literally on the brink here for 13 days. I don't know this for a fact. I looked up every historical record I could, but I couldn't find anything that said it. But I sincerely doubt that for 13 days, President Kennedy got a whole lot of sleep. So everywhere he turned, his advisors kept saying, "Sir, I don't understand what you're doing. We got to attack. We got to take care of this. We can still make this work. We can probably still take over this whole thing. We can wipe them out. It'll be over." He had all sorts of political pundits and detractors telling everybody this is the proof that the president is indecisive, that he should not be president, that he was too young because he's one of the youngest presidents of all time. That he should not be in this role. He's not a good leader because he's not doing anything. And yet, in spite of all of these people criticizing and questioning the decision that President Kennedy made, he stayed firm. We're just going to set up a parameter. That's it. Finally, after 13 days, 13 of the most tense days the world may have ever really come across at that point, the Russian government announced that they were going to be taking down the silos that they had built on the island of Cuba. They were going to begin to dismantle all these nuclear weapons that they had amassed there. 13 days, and finally, this crisis was over. And all of a sudden, you started to see all those pundits and those detractors and those advisors who were questioning everything Kennedy said and everything that Kennedy did and every decision that he made along the way. They were all finally able to say, "Wow, that was a great choice." Because it was able to take something that was escalating and de-escalate it simply by staying put. The choice didn't make sense to them in the moment, but when the smoke cleared and the dust settled and everything was resolved, it made all the sense in the world. It was the best possible option that could have happened. Even though everybody was telling him to choose otherwise, Kennedy remained steadfast, and things began to calm because of it. Being in any form of leadership is a difficult thing because you are entrusted with leading other people. So no matter what type of leadership it is, whether we're talking about being president of the United States or we're talking about being the part-time manager at a grocery store, there is pressure that's involved there because that leadership is going to be questioned. That leadership is going to be challenged at every turn. You have to make choices that influence the lives of other people. Understand, that's a big statement. You make choices that influence the lives of other people. Leadership is not for everyone because it is a weighty thing that takes place. You have to be the one to make the choices. You have to be the one to steer the ship, and you have to be willing to be criticized for it. But good leaders will weigh all the choices that they have to make and act in the best interest of those that they're in charge of. Good leaders will stay steadfast in their decisions, whether or not everybody agrees with it in the moment. Good leaders will own up to the mistakes that they make, because everybody makes mistakes. The choices that they make might seem foolish or even ridiculous in the moment, but oftentimes those best leaders will be seen for what they are in the long run, even if in the moment the decision doesn't make a lot of sense. Even Solomon made a choice that not everybody understood what he was doing. Even in the moment, it didn't make a whole lot of sense, but it was ultimately seen to be the right choice. It comes from a story that you're likely familiar with, because I think out of all of the passages that talk about Solomon, and even all the things in Scripture that Solomon himself wrote, this particular narrative is probably the most well-known. I've heard it referenced in all sorts of media and sitcoms even will reference this sort of thing, because it's such a story that we're familiar with, but it comes to us in 1 Kings chapter 3, starting in verse 16. So if you got your Bible, please open it up to 1 Kings 3:16. If you don't have your Bible, but you got your phone, open up your Bible app to 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 16. But as you're doing so, let me point out that this narrative takes place just after where we left things off last week. If you recall last week, we talked about the idea that even though in our minds and in our lives, we kind of always know that David was king and then Solomon followed it, but we learned that there was a lot of stuff that took place between there. Right? We learned that under a traditional monarchy system, Solomon should not have been able to sniff the throne, let alone sit on it. He was not the firstborn son of David. He was further down the line, but that God had a role for Solomon to fill, and so God made sure that Solomon was in that role. He worked behind the scenes, working in ways that Solomon didn't even realize until it had already happened. And when Solomon was finally placed on the throne, he went to go do the most natural thing that a king of a nation that is established by God should do. He went to go and worship God. And when he did so, God appeared before him and said, "Ask. Whatever you want, you got." And Solomon could have asked God for anything, but he asked God for the wisdom to be able to do the job that God had placed for him, the role that God had had him fill. He asked for the wisdom to do that role effectively. And that God was so pleased by this particular request that God gave him that and a whole lot more. And that wisdom that Solomon asked for would be put to the test almost immediately, because seemingly just within a little bit of time of Solomon being king of all of Israel, he gets this in particular encounter. We read it in 1 Kings 3:16, and it begins with two unexpected people appearing before Solomon. It says, then two women who were prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. Now, I don't know about you, but it strikes me as incredibly interesting that two women who are part of the oldest profession in the world would be allowed to come and stand before the king. That's an unusual thing to think of, right? These are people who are sort of cast aside in almost every society that they're involved in. And yet here they are being able to plead their case in front of the most powerful man in the nation. This tells me that above all, Solomon as king wanted to make sure that the needs of every single one of his subjects, whether what they did was respectable or not, he wanted to make sure that they knew they could come and speak to their king. This is an odd thing for sure, because again, throughout history, this is not a profession of high honor. Yet Solomon is willing to listen to them anyway. And this is such an unusual story that he's told. One of the women shares with Solomon her side of the story, of what this debate that's going on between the two of them is, starting in verse 17, going into 21. It says, one woman said, "Please, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house. I had a baby while she was in the house. On the third day after I gave birth, she also had a baby, and we were alone. No one else was in the house with us. Just the two of us were there. During the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him. She got up in the middle of the night, took my son from my side while your servant was asleep. She laid him in her arms and put her dead son in my arms." Whew, what a sentence. "When I got up in the morning to nurse my son, I discovered he was dead. That morning I looked closely at him and I realized this was not the son I gave birth to." There is a lot going on in this story. And again, I think when it comes to narratives like this, narratives that we are so familiar with that we don't really look at this moment, right? We kind of know how this story is going to play out. We know what's going to go on, and we know how the story ends. And so we kind of just move past it. But understand, there is a lot of things that are taking place here. First off, you have these two prostitutes who are living together. Right? That's something that would make sense, right? I mean, they have a shared profession. Typically, those types of things would be around each other. And during the time that they're living together, they both become pregnant at the same time, probably an occupational hazard. Grandma laughed. Yes. So they get pregnant around the same time, and they both give birth within days of one another. And while they're in the process of nursing their children and taking care of them, one of these ladies rolls over on top of her son, and he dies. Understand, a baby has died. There is no chance whatsoever that this moment could be anything other than hugely emotional. And this woman, when she realizes that her son is now dead, grief overtakes her. And I don't know what your experience is with people who are grieving. I've been around a few. Man, some of the decisions that people make while they're in the midst of grief, some of the actions that they take, some of the words that they say, they probably wouldn't do normally. And this woman in her grief decides, you know what, I still need a kid. I need a living, breathing son. So she sneaks into her friend's room and swaps kids. She places her dead son in the arms of another woman, so hoping that she'll believe that her child is the one that's died. This is a pretty major accusation to make. This is something that is devastating. It's going to be a moment, because there's going to be that moment when that woman wakes up in the morning that at first, we know she sees the son's face and she recognizes this ain't my kid, but there's still going to be a moment where she's believing her child is dead. This is a very tense situation going on between these two. And when it came to give a response to this accusation, the other woman replied rather simply, but incredibly coldly. In verse 22, she said, "No," the other woman said, "my son is the living one, your son is the dead one." What a thing to say to your roommate. I mean, I would assume that these two, having lived together, being roommates, they're probably buddies. What a terrible thing to say to your friend. The idea that she could say something like this without even blinking is just absolutely astounding here. The two of them actually get to the point that they're arguing. You can see there at the tail end of verse 22, it says, "So they argued before the king." These two women who are part of a profession that absolutely nobody in their lives would ever say they could be considered trustworthy, have somehow managed to get their way to plead their case in front of the king, and now they're arguing in front of him. And again, we could look at that and say that's kind of comical, but understand this arguing is incredibly emotional. This is very tense. There is a lot at stake in this particular case. If Solomon doesn't make the right choice, it could very well end with one woman killing another woman. These are two mothers fighting over the custody of a child. Moms in the room, you know that if it was your child, you're going to go for blood, right? There are very few times that my wife has ever scared me. I've seen her when she's felt our child is being threatened in some way, shape, or form, and I wouldn't want to mess with her then. These women are facing a hugely emotional situation. It is getting incredibly ugly because emotions are raw and tensions are high. And to further complicate matters, and I don't think we ever think about this particular element of it. To further complicate matters, there is absolutely no one who can testify to this. There's nobody who can give any sort of evidence to this situation being even remotely true. Right? If you're in any particular court case, you always have witnesses who come forward, and they're either character witnesses to talk about this person and see how they're really a great person reputation-wise. Well, these are two prostitutes. Nobody's saying that. Or you have witnesses who've seen this event take place and can share their side of the story to say what's really going on here. Well, they were alone. This is a case of one woman's word against another, with the life of a child at stake. Again, I know probably all of you, most at least, know how this story ends. For just a moment, I want you to do everything you can to kind of shut that part of your brain off and ask yourself the question, how would you try to resolve this situation? I got a buddy who's a lawyer, and I asked him about this, saying, hey, what would happen if this was an actual case that was in front of us? And he said, well, unfortunately, a mistrial would be called and it'd be thrown out. Because there's no witnesses. There's no physical evidence to say one or the other. I mean, nowadays we could do DNA checks for sure, but this is well before we have that, way before we have that technology. So this would be thrown out. There would be no resolution to this. How would you personally try to resolve the situation? If you're Solomon and you're hearing this case being pleaded and you know what's at stake, how do you possibly come to a resolution for this particular thing? But fortunately, a few days before this, Solomon made a request of God. And God decided to grant that request because he has a way to resolve this particular problem. And it's rather... Again, we know this story, but this is a unique solution to the problem. It starts off in verse 24 whenever Solomon makes a request. He says simply, "Bring me a sword." Okay. I'm going to guess that when Solomon made the request to have a sword brought for him, all of a sudden he had everybody in the room's attention. Right? If you're having an argument with somebody else in front of me and I say, "Hey, somebody bring me a gun," I'm going to guess it gets real quiet, right? I mean, even if I said, "Bring me a sword," it's probably still going to get kind of quiet. Solomon requests to bring a sword. They got to wonder, why does he want this sword? But he's a king. You got to do what he says. So they bring him out a sword. And he lays out what the sword is for in verse 25 when he says, "Cut the living boy in two and give half to one and half the other." Again, you and I know what he's doing here. We know this story, right? But again, try to remove yourself from that and put yourself in the perspective of somebody in the room. You've just watched these two mothers have an incredibly emotional and tense argument about who is the true mother of this child and who is the mother of a child that has already died. And now your brand new king, still got that new king smell to him, still too early in his reign to determine whether or not he's going to be a good king, has just offered this solution. We got one kid who's already dead. We're going to kill this other one and give half to one, half to the other. Again, we don't have a record of this, but I'm going to guess there was at least one person in the room, if not everybody, who responded simply, "What are you doing? How does this resolve anything? How does this only makes the situation so much worse." I mean, yeah, you could argue that it makes everything even, I guess. Because now they're both the mothers of dead children. But what they didn't know, what you and I do know, is that Solomon was looking for a reaction. He was looking for a particular response because he knew that this is the only way he's going to resolve a case where there are no witnesses, where it's one woman's word against another, and neither one of their words can really be trusted. He's looking for a response. He's looking for a reaction. He's looking for something to showcase who the true mother is. And sure enough, after he makes this proclamation, he gets the reaction he's looking for because both women react, and they could not react in more different ways. We see their reaction in verse 26. It says, "The woman whose son was alive spoke to the king because she felt great compassion for her son. 'My lord, give her the living baby,' she said, 'but please don't have him killed.' The other one said, 'He will not be mine or yours. Cut him in two.'" One woman is willing to release her claim on the child, to say, "You know what, I'm out of this argument if this is what it's going to result in, because I'd much rather have my son live with her than my son to be dead. I would much rather know that he is still alive, that he is still growing, that he is still going to have a chance at life than to live with a dead son." And the other one is cheering on the idea that this baby will be killed. We can look at that and say, how callous could she possibly be? That's an easy response, I think, for us. But again, folks, please don't miss what's really going on here. This woman is grieving. And grief will do incredibly different things to your brain. It will make you say things that you don't mean. It will cause you to take actions that you wouldn't normally take. It is something that is incredibly harsh, and it will callous and harden hearts that otherwise wouldn't be. But her reaction shows Solomon exactly what it is that he needs to see. He responds in verse 27, "Give the living baby to the first woman and don't kill him, because she's his mother." In seeing their reaction, Solomon sees what he needs to know. He sees the full picture, the full scope of what's actually taking place here. That one woman in her grief made a horrible choice and is now willing to inflict the same pain that she already feels on her friend. And the other woman would rather her child live with somebody else but still be alive. So it was easy for him to determine this is who it is. And this decision, when it's reached, when everybody who was questioning Solomon just a minute ago when he said cut the baby in two, everybody who's going, what is going on here? This dude's nuts. He's lost it. The king is crazy. We're all in trouble. Are now all of a sudden going, oh, huh. Because now Solomon's decision that he made in that moment, that when everybody is questioning him around him, and everybody is saying, I don't know about this, king, everybody's able to say, you know what? He was right. That choice that didn't make any sense to us now makes utter sense in the whole wide world. And the whole story gets wrapped up in verse 28 because it tells us the reaction of the people. It says, all Israel heard about the judgment the king had given, and they stood in awe of him, because they saw that God's wisdom was in him to carry out judgment. I absolutely love the way that that's phrased. Because understand, Solomon made this decision. Solomon was the one who made this proclamation. Solomon was the one who declared who the rightful mother was. And yet, even in the midst of that, God is still given the glory. Right? The people can see that this wisdom that Solomon has, this doesn't come from an earthly style of wisdom. This can only come from God himself. They recognize the hand of God at work in Solomon in his leadership because that's what truly great leaders do. They reflect the wisdom and the leadership of God himself. It is so difficult, oh my goodness, particularly in our day and age, to be able to point out who are truly good leaders. Right? I was reflecting on this. My daughter's school, because it was election week, they decided to do something fun and cute and everything like that. They had a vote for what was the best soda. Right? It's silly, but whatever. And I told, when Robin was, it was Robin, right? Or was it? Yeah, Robin was telling me about what, this particular vote. I said just, flippantly, because it's me and you guys know me, I'm weird and funny and stuff like that. I said, well, you should vote for Dr. Pepper because he's a doctor. She said, well, Dr. Pepper didn't make the cut. We have 3 choices, Coca-Cola, Mountain Dew, or A&W root beer. And I went, wow, those are lousy choices. It's just like a real election. Because that just seems to be the types of leaders that we get to choose, worse or terrible. Right? We don't know what real good leaders look like, it seems like, because those people are just either not pursuing leadership positions or they're becoming corrupted by other elements and things in the world. And so when we see Solomon as somebody who's doing a genuinely great job of leadership, somebody who is able to showcase the wisdom of God, it's easy to identify him as being a good leader. But understand, the world is hurting for good leadership. More than that, the church is hurting for good leaders and for good leadership. Men and women who will usher the church into the presence of God, who will make tough choices about direction and about discipleship and about discipline sometimes. Who will make those choices with humility, with grace, who will own up to their failures and their mistakes, because sometimes we get it wrong. But people who will continue unafraid in the face of mounting resistance from the world around us. This kind of leadership is something the church needs and has needed from the very foundation. I'm going to ask you to cast your mind back quite a bit. If you recall, I think it was maybe a year or 2 ago, we spent weeks talking about Acts 2, verse 42. And if you recall from that particular verse, we said that they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. The church came under the leadership of the apostles, from the men who had learned from Jesus himself. And more than that, as the church continued to grow and develop and spread all throughout the place, the apostle Paul himself would train and send out others into leadership positions so that they could continue to usher the church in the direction that it would go. Oftentimes, most of the epistles that we get are letters from Paul to church leaders, offering encouragement, offering direction, offering ideas of how they can make things better in their church. They're meant to guide those leaders in the ways that they need to go. Simply put, the church as a whole, from its very foundation all the way to today, church needs good leaders. It needs men and women who are willing to step up, and regardless as to what the criticisms they may face, regardless as to what the people are saying behind their back, still willing to lead the church in the direction that God would have it go. Not just the church as a whole, but this church needs good leaders. Understand, this church has been very blessed with the leadership that we have. Our elders, our deacons, our men who have led this church in ways that you have seen, visual ways, things that are obvious to everybody, and ways that you've never seen. They've worked behind the scenes in this church in ways that you've never noticed before. But they do it because they love this church. And they want to see it continue to grow to become the church that God has called it to be, to become the church that Jesus would have Macedonia Christian Church become. But there are only a few. There are only a few who have stepped up and taken on the role of leadership in this church. They are godly men. They have done a fantastic job, and I am happy to be associated with them. But they are few. If Macedonia Christian Church is going to continue to grow and to continue to develop, to be the church that God wants us to be, we need good leaders. We need people who are willing to step up and to fill gaps and willing to do things that other people aren't doing because we can't do it on our own. Our elders, our deacons, they are great men of God, but they can't do it by themselves. This is one of those times where an application is really only targeting about 3 or 4 of you, not necessarily everybody, but we need godly men and women who are willing to step up, to take ownership of this church, to take leadership, to point us in the direction that God would have it go. I'm not going to lie, church leadership, any leadership, but church leadership is not an easy thing. It's not. It's something that is going to open yourself up to criticism. It's something where people are going to talk about you behind your back. It's where people are going to confront you to your face sometimes and say, you're an idiot for choosing this. But good leaders will continue on, will press forward. If they believe the decision is right, and if they believe the decision is godly, they will continue on in spite of what the criticism is. And I know that eventually those good church leaders will be seen for what they are. But we need more, because any load that's shared is a load that is lighter. I want to challenge every single person in this room here today to do something that maybe you do, maybe you don't. Pray for our leaders. Pray for the guys who usher this church into worship of God. Pray for the guys who have to make the decisions, because it's tough. It's not easy. I can tell you that they don't make any decision lightly here, outside of maybe whether or not we use brown or white paper towels in the bathrooms. That's a decision that doesn't matter. Go for what's cheapest, right? But they make such weighty decisions about the direction this church is going to go in, and they need your prayers. They need your support. They need you pleading with God to help continue to lead them in the ways that He would have them go. Some of you in here, you need to step up. God has given you the tools and the resources to become a great church leader, and we need you. Pray for our leadership. If this church is going to be effective, if this church is going to continue to grow, it's going to be because we have good leaders who lead well. The Apostle Paul wrote of the kinds of leaders that we should look for in Titus, chapter 1, verses 5 through 9, and we'll close with it today. He said, "The reason I left you in Crete was to set right what was left undone And I directed you to appoint elders in every town. An elder must be blameless, the husband of one wife, with faithful children who are not accused of wildness or rebellion. As an overseer of God's household, he must be blameless, not arrogant, not hot-tempered, not an excessive drinker, not a bully, not greedy for money, but hospitable, loving what is good, sensible. I like that word there for leadership. Sensible, righteous, holy, self-controlled, holding to the faithful message as taught, so that he will be able to both encourage with sound teaching and to refute those who contradict it.